One of the big criticisms of contemporary education is that people are teaching children, the teachers are teaching children what to think, not how to think. But when you describe this, I'm almost wondering, are you not also telling people what they're supposed to think about the past in these sections?
That's a fun question. I would answer no in the sense that we're teaching what happened. Certainly this is a history book. We have to explain what happened. But we're trying to give a kind of language through which kids can understand what happened. The problem is existing books don't give context. So it's like reading a foreign language. It's like we're giving these kids like Japanese books or whatever and forcing them to learn the language of history. By talking about how it relates to our world today, what we're trying to do is help them understand the language of history, how to discuss historical events and how to apply it to their world today, and really spark questions. So our Let's Talk About It sections at the end of every chapter are more designed to get kids talking to their parents or teachers about what happened, not by us saying, here's a conclusive interpretation of what happened in the past and what it means for you, but instead to say, we think this relates to this modern event. What do you think about it? Let's talk about and evaluate this. I'll answer your question in this additional way. I was bullied a lot when I was a kid. I was a late bloomer, so I was very short in high school. I was picked on, I was thrown in trash cans. It was a very unpleasant experience. There are two ways I think that I can approach and frame my own past. One is to say, I'm a victim. Other people were unfair. I deserve reparations. Every bad thing in my life is because I was bullied when I was a kid. How dare the world, woe is me, I'm a victim. I've chosen to take a second route by looking at my past, and that is to frame it in a way to say, maybe those kids who bullied me were being abused at home, and they didn't know how to handle that. Maybe I can have compassion for the underdog today because I know what it's been like to be an underdog. Maybe I can be empowered to be kinder and help others because I know what it's like to... So I can frame my past to have a better future. And when we talk about like the 1619 Project and critical race theory and these other things that are trying to shame Americans about their own past and make us feel guilty and bad about ourselves, I think that's the wrong way to look at history. I think we need to frame history in a way not to say, here's what happened and here's what to think about it, but instead to say, here's the history with all of its warts and bumps and bruises. How can we look at what happened in the past to better empower you and better, make a better world today? And that's what we're trying to do, is have history be a narrative that serves these kids to say, what does it mean for you today, and what can we draw from the past that will help us make a better future?
Before we continue, I just have a message from one of our sponsors. For all of you with retirement savings accounts, America's federal debt is now at $30 trillion, and our policies during this pandemic are causing inflation to soar to multi-decade highs. A lot of folks are rightly worried about what this will mean for their retirement savings. You can protect your life savings with the only thing that has always held value, physical gold and silver. To get started, you can call Goldco at 855-973-0470 for a free wealth protection kit. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They guarantee highest price buybacks, and they always offer free shipping. Ask how you can even get $10,000 or more in free silver. Don't wait. Call 855-973-0470. Now that's 855-973-0470. What would be an example of, sort of a dark aspect of American history that you tackle in the book that you try to, basically give it as it was and
Sure.
not
Yeah, I'd say there's two. Certainly how the founders dealt with the Native Americans who were here and how colonization impacted some of the natives. That's one. Slavery is the second. Obviously, it's the easiest. And as I mentioned a moment ago, with like the 1619 Project and others, there are people who bring up that part of the past to make us feel horrible, to say there should be reparations, to talk about white supremacy and capital.
Well, they say that it's the defining
Yes.
feature and structure of the America,
Yes.
right? So that's how they frame it.
Again, because they're doing that, I believe, because they're fundamentally Marxist, the people who are doing this. What they're doing by saying that is they're wanting to take America in a different direction. Because again, history is all about framing something for a narrative that designs your present and your future. these individuals who are saying things like this, 1619 Project, many of these people are Marxists. They want to undermine the classical liberal heritage of America to take us in a more socialist Marxist direction. How best can you do that? It's by trying to cut at the knees the founding fathers and the ideas that they stood for, by trying to make people disassociate themselves with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and others and say, oh, icky, they were slave owners, how evil they were. And by disassociating ourselves from those individuals, we are also disregarding the ideas that they stood for. It becomes a very problematic situation precisely because these people are creating this narrative to take our future in a different direction that I disagree with.
Well, there's this idea of, sort of separating society from its the culture in which it was steeped in. That's like every communist revolution, or basically attempted to do it, or did it successfully.
Yeah,
that's what strikes me as you're speaking here.
Well, as we had to figure this out for the book, how do you talk to kids about these ideas? How do you talk to an 8-year-old about slavery? How do you talk about the nuance that's needed? Do you just say this was evil and everyone who did it was evil, or do you recognize it for what it was at the time? Can we look at someone like Thomas Jefferson, who had a very complicated situation himself with slavery, inherited a lot of slaves, kept a lot of slaves, and yet he himself was ahead of his time because he was privately writing and thinking about this moral evil, he called it, trying to figure out how to extricate himself and the society of which he was a part from this problem. And so he, like many others at the time, grew up in this system. It was their culture, but we can't look at it through a lens of our modern day educated, society and judge them differently. We can call it evil on its face, but we can at least afford them a measure of grace to recognize that when they're brought up in a system like that, and when there's all these economic and cultural and religious and other pressures kind of keeping this type of environment, it's very hard for someone to act differently when that's all they've known. And so in the book, we bring up slavery, to your earlier question, tackling this issue. We bring it up, but we approach it in a way to say, let's recognize that these people thought and lived differently from us, and so let's try and look at it through their life and their worldview, rather than just punish them and judge them with our modern sophisticated understanding, because by trying to understand them more, then we can learn from them. If we just say, they had slaves, they're all evil, ignorant rubes and white supremacists, we can't learn anything from them. We're alienating ourselves not only from them as individuals, but from the ideas that they believed that were good. And so we're trying to have that nuance to say, they made some mistakes, there were some horrible things that happened, to be sure, but also there was some good as well, and let's build upon that.
In the book, you talk about this question of, for example, just prior to 1776, right? Obviously, there was a huge challenge to authority that was fomenting, right? People were very unhappy. No taxation without representation, and a lot more, right? And people took it upon themselves to stand up against the crown, was sort of standing up to authority. Frankly, I found myself thinking, looking back at a number of different scenarios, but also, when you look at the BLM protests, and some of which were riots and so forth, certainly some of the people that were involved were thinking to themselves, there's something bad that's happening in society. We believe it. We need to stand up, right? And so you have a very interesting way of tackling that.
It is a challenge. I will say it's a challenge to tackle these complex and controversial current events and modern situations in a way that we don't want to be pushy for kids. We don't want to scare them. We're not trying to say all these horrible things are happening. Again, ours is an effort to say, what can we learn from all of this and be better people and try and live a better society. This one was an interesting lesson because here you have many of the founding fathers and their compatriots of the time being part of what was called the Minutemen militia, being ready at a moment's notice to go fight. Well, who were they fighting? They were fighting their own government. There was no separate government. They had these local councils and things that they were forming, but they were all Englishmen. They were still part of this government, and the British Redcoats were not this occupying military force from another country. It was basically their own military or National Guard, who were there. And so when they came to Lexington and conquered, the shot heard around the world, right? here's this clash between the locals and their own government. And the government was there to take the supplies, you know, to try and deter some of the civil unrest from Boston that had been happening. Nevertheless, these people had a decision for themselves, and that is, the conflict is coming. These individuals are here. Are we going to fight them, or are we just going to submit and stand for nothing? I think of COVID. I mean, here's a case where people were going against their own conscience and doing what they were told, shutting down their businesses, not worshiping at church, you know, wearing a mask, you know, getting the jab and so forth. Can't say the V word because then, you know, we get deplatformed or whatever now, right? But here's these people who are submitting to all of these things that they believe is wrong. Many people thought that these things were wrong. And they have this question to ask for themselves. Do I go along with what I'm being told? Do I trust authority and believe that what they're telling me is true? Or do I figure things out for myself and then act based on what I know? So suddenly what happened in 1775, 150 years later, has relevance for us if we look at that story through a lens of saying, what can we learn from the past to apply today? Suddenly the Minutemen in Lexington and Concord, it wasn't just about this isolated battle that has no relevance to our modern world. Instead, we're placing ourselves in their shoes to say, what might I have done? And then once I think through that, what might I do today? And how does that impact the decisions that I'm going to make about when I submit to authority, when I trust authority, or if I'm going to act based on my conscience or what I think is right. So those are the things we're trying to get at in the book, is not just let's review history and learn what happened. It's more like we've got a lot of stuff going on today, and we've got to evaluate what's right and what's wrong and what's good. You know, why not try and draw from history a lot of inspiring examples and compelling stories that can help us evaluate those decisions that we have today? That's what we're trying to do.